So this session is called The Time is Now, Democratizing Data in FinTech. And it's going to be moderated by Aisling Finn, reporter at AltFi. Remember that you can ask any question through the chat, and of course, also tweet and share your insights over social media using the hashtag CogX 2021. But enough from me, over to you, Ashley.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session. As Olga mentioned, my name is Aisling Finn. I'm a reporter at AltFi. Today, we'll be discussing what the democratization of data means for both consumers and businesses, trends in the sector, and how we can bring those lagging behind up to speed, to name just a few topics. As Olga mentioned again, pop any questions you have for our speakers in the chat, and we will endeavour to get round to as many of them as possible at the end of the session. Now, I would like to bring the first of today's speaker to the stage. Welcome to Eva Wong, co-founder and chief operating officer of Canadian financial stability fintech, Borrowell. How are you today, Eva, and where are you dialing in from?
I'm very well. Thank you so much. I am calling in from Toronto, Canada. Despite the fact I believe I have a photo of New York in the background, I am in Toronto.
Lovely, thank you. And now I'd like to welcome Billie Simmons, co-founder and chief operating officer of LGBT plus focused digital banking service, Daylight. Hi, Billie. How are you, and where are you joining us from?
Hello. I am in New York. I don't have any photos behind me, but yes, I'm very well, thank you.
Lovely, thank you. First things first, I think it's probably a good idea to establish what data democratization means for our speakers on the panel today, because I imagine we've got some differing perspectives. So Eva, can you please start us off? What does data democratization mean for you and Borrowell?
Yeah, I think that there are two ways of looking at data democratization, probably even more than that. But as we were chatting beforehand, I think there's a consumer lens to this as well as a fintech, maybe more B2B lens to that. And I think that both of those are really important. For those who aren't familiar with Borrowell, we were the first company to make credit scores available for free to Canadians. And so I think that's an example of data democratization. This is, a number that matters for applying for a loan, a mortgage, an auto loan. It will determine perhaps whether a landlord is willing to rent a flat or an apartment to you. Employers look at this number, but prior to Borrowell, people couldn't get access to it unless they paid a credit bureau in order to get access. So I think that's one small example of data democratization. And then I think there's a data democratization around who does have access to data, who can say, who grants that access. So I think the whole open banking and open finance is another way of thinking about data democratization.
Amazing, thank you. And Billie, same question to you. What does data democratization mean to Daylight?
Yeah, I mean, I think I can agree with Eva there that there's kind of many angles that you can look at it. Agree with the consumer one. I think it's important more now than ever for consumers to have access to data that's going to make their lives better. I also think from a business perspective, even kind of in-house at Daylight, the democratization of data has allowed us to make a lot of decisions a lot faster across the entire structure. We're still a small team of about 8 people, but the fact that the product team can access data that might only have previously been available to the developers, for example, and also our marketing team can see that data as well, means that we're kind of able to all be on the same page, able to kind of make decisions and do kind of fun and exciting things with that data to help make our businesses better.
Amazing. And Daylight's about to turn 1 in a couple of weeks' time. So were there maybe any hiccups that you encountered along the road that you maybe didn't anticipate? Is there anything that you can share with our audience?
That's a really good question. I mean, I can, to sort of pull back the curtain a little bit up until, probably only a couple of months ago, where we literally hand counting all of our, beta customers and monitoring the transactions manually. So it has been, a big transformation for us over the past quarter, I'd say, in terms of We use a great tool called Retool, which allows us to basically throw a bunch of data at it and pull out a bunch of different assumptions, which has just made all of our lives a lot easier. Probably something I would have done a lot sooner, but that's kind of the name of the game when you're very, very early stage.
And Eva, Borrowell is 7 years old, been going strong for the past 7 years, and as you mentioned, was the first company to offer free credit scoring in Canada. What trends have you seen over your time in the industry?
Well, I think 7 years in fintech is it's eons, right? So much has happened in the world, I think, of fintech over the last few years. So there's been many trends. I remember, at the beginning, there was a lot to talk about between like bank and fintech partnerships, and that I think is a trend that is still going strong. In the beginning of sort of fintech, I would say that sort of 7 to 10 years ago, many companies were focused just on a single product, whether that be online lending or whatever the product is. And I think companies quickly realized that the cost of acquiring a customer, especially on the B2C side, if you only are able to sell them one product, that really isn't a really sustainable business model. So I think it's been very exciting to see fintech companies, especially those who are more on the B2C side, expand out to offer multiple products.
Lovely. And I've certainly found in my coverage of data democratization and open banking, open finance, all those lovely fintech buzzwords that seem to crop up all the time, that education seems to be one of the biggest barriers to its adoption. So people seem to often be quite wary about sharing their financial data. Billie, would you agree with this? Or have you, or is it different over in the States?
I think I would agree with that ultimately. Inherently, anyone that signs up for a neobank that's been in business for less than a year is going to be an early adopter and have an early adopter mindset, and so I think be a lot more comfortable with sharing that data. But yeah, I think there's definitely a big barrier to any kind of customer acquisition is, can I trust this organization? Are they going to do the right thing with all the information that I'm giving them? Are they going to, look after my money? Certainly, that makes up a big bulk of the questions from potential customers that we get is, who are you? Who are you backed by? How do we know that you're safe? I think there's a healthy amount of skepticism within the consumer space.
And how would you tackle that as a sort of a startup founder?
I mean, it's hard, right? Because you can do everything right. I think there's an additional level of complexity with a vulnerable community like the LGBT community. We've been accused before of essentially making a list of LGBT people, and so the stakes are even higher, and it's important to just really take this stuff very, very seriously and make sure that you are, meeting all the standards of best practices with security, and making sure that all of your data is not just kind of flying freely in the wind or something. But it's interesting because I think it's there is this kind of interesting crunch point between the democratization of data, the idea that you can access, anyone at the company can access data. How do you make sure that data is kept safely, and that kind of thing? So, anonymizing the data, making sure that we have secure practices with our devices, with our laptops, with our passwords, that kind of thing, and just taking it really, really seriously.
And Eva, would you agree that sort of education is a real barrier to the adoption of open banking and data democratization?
Yeah, I would. I think it's interesting because for sure, I think there's hesitancy, perhaps from some people who aren't, when you're past that early adopter stage, in order to try fintech. I do think just sometimes lack of awareness is one thing. I remember visiting London a number of years ago now, and in the tube, it felt like every other ad was a fintech company, which I was really impressed with. I just thought it was like so great. It felt like, there was a real appetite to try fintech companies and a real openness to that. And I don't know that that exists to the same degree in Canada. I do think that's changing. I think one of the things that's different in Canada versus the US or the UK is Canadians don't necessarily maybe have the same level of animosity toward their banks that I know some people in the UK and the US do, where there's a high level of distrust based on some of the practices that happened. I think in Canada, the banks maybe weren't, and I'm sure it's not across the board, maybe didn't have as many of the sort of predatory practices, but it is an oligopoly, and Canadian bank profits are exceedingly high. But Canadians are also very proud that during the 2008 financial crisis, the Canadian banks were strong. So there's this element of sort of like risk aversion, I think, with Canadians. And someone once described it to me as the relationship with your bank in Canada is like the relationship with your mother. You can complain about her, but you're never going to leave her, and you don't want anyone else to complain about her. So yeah, I think Canadians have this sort of funny affiliation where they're very proud of the banks in some ways, proud that they're like the biggest companies. They compete on a global scale. And so I think we have to be very careful as fintech companies that we're not anti-bank in a way. Whereas a lot of fintech adoption around the world comes from an anti-bank sentiment. I don't know that that works to the same degree in Canada. And I'd say for us, we work really closely with the banks. And so we're not necessarily anti-bank. We think that Canadians should have more choice, and we think we complement some of the bank offerings really well.
I mean, I'm not sure if you would have seen this in the States, Billie, but certainly here in the UK, fintechs were born out of the 2008 financial crisis. And because so many people had this huge level of distrust towards the digital banks. And I think something like open banking, which is not even a really new term, but is something that younger companies are pushing, is maybe why some people are slightly more wary of it, because it's not coming from the traditional big bricks and mortar banks that people are so used to banking with. And it's these new digital disruptors that are coming through and doing exactly what it says on the tin, disrupting the space.
I think it almost comes from, over here in the US, there's distrust, but there's also like banking kind of sucks over here. Like I grew up in the UK, and when I first moved over here, I had to sign up for a bank using a paper application physically there. And then I remember I had to pay like a contractor, and I had to write a paper check. And I've never written a paper check before, because in the UK that's just
so
yeah, no, exactly. And in the UK, you just you can just send a transfer over immediately to a bank account number, and that infrastructure until really, really recently didn't exist in the US. So I think I've noticed a big on the subways here, Current, which is a neobank over here, positions itself specifically as not a bank. Like we're an innovative place for you to hold your money, but we're not like all the other banks. And so I think there's a lot of and indeed a lot of what we do at Daylight is around banking in the US is not good enough for consumers in general, and from an infrastructure and sort of product perspective, but also for LGBT people specifically. We are not being served, and our needs are not being met. And so I can't imagine either like what that's like in Canada, having to kind of walk that line between not offending and also purporting to do better.
And I guess as well, we've kind of touched upon this topic, but the consumer is at the heart of data democratization. It was introduced to try and make banking fairer and to make the bigger banks sort of less competitive, and to create this more sort of meritocracy rather than monopoly that we have at the moment, particularly here in the UK with the 4 big banks. So how, as we move forward to a more digitally focused world with the consumer in mind, what can we do to ensure we focus on financial inclusion? Billie, I'll come to you first.
I think really it's about making sure that you're always serving the customer, at the end of the day, and the customer's needs and the customer's, desires. Something that we're looking at building at the moment is the ability to assess your existing spending and see how in line with your values it is. Because we've seen a really big trend recently from consumers in wanting to put their money where their mouth is, and only spend at either LGBT friendly businesses or even eco-friendly businesses, or businesses that support racial justice, things like that. And so I think, at Daylight, we're by the community for the community. And I think it's about making sure that everything you're doing is in service of the customer rather than in service of profit. And I think that's where incumbent banks have kind of gone wrong in the US, is everything has been like, okay, what can we do to this data to like make more money? And how can we withhold information so that they get, don't get as good deals and that kind of thing. And so, making sure that you are proceeding with the customer's well-being at your core of all of your decisions, I think is really important.
And obviously, Eva, we mentioned this, the relationship between the banks and consumers in Canada is probably slightly warmer than it is in the States and the UK. So how do you think we can focus more on financial inclusion as we move towards sort of a more digital world?
I think that is one thing, is that the banks aren't necessarily focused on the 50% of Canadians who are living paycheck to paycheck. And that percentage, I think, is very similar in the US and the UK, especially as more people are doing freelance and gig work. There definitely is more of that gig economy where, again, people are living more paycheck to paycheck. They don't have a company provided pension or benefits in many situations. So I don't know that the banks do a great job serving the needs of those customers, but I also don't know that the banks, want or are, recruiting those customers. So I think that for us is where we're focused. Again, we think that this is an underserved, not even a niche. It's obviously like a big percentage of the Canadian population. I think for us, making sure that we're serving those needs, we focused a lot more in the last few years on research, user research, just, having our product designers and product managers not make assumptions that we would know what's best for our customer base. A lot of times, as Billie had sort of mentioned, people have had bad experiences with predatory lenders or people not treating their data with respect. And so they are quite wary. And for us, like, one of the key principles that we have is user trust. And so I think just holding that very closely, as well as, again, not making assumptions that, we know what our users are going to want, and making sure that we're doing that real research.
And obviously, Billie, Daylight was kind of born out of your own personal frustrations with the banking system in the US. So how can it improve? How can banks in the US improve and move forward?
I think Eva kind of said it, like not making assumptions about what customers want, empowering customers to kind of lead the way. And I think that is kind of one of the beautiful things about the democratization, it's quite a hard word to say, isn't it, of data, because we have choice now. If I want to go and open a credit card or get a bank loan, I can compare all of the existing, bank loans and credit cards that are out there and see what's best for me. Previously I would probably just walk to my local bank and I would say, give me a loan, or can I open a credit card? And I think that has in many ways allowed consumers to vote with their feet. They're going to go to whatever product best serves them and listens to them. And I think that that is how incumbents have kind of got to where they are today, is they've made a lot of assumptions. They've just presumed that everyone has the same lived experiences and need the same products. We talk to customers and, potential customers every week, like multiple times, and are in constant conversation to make sure that we're not losing our way. And it's really easy to do, actually. Like, we did a ton of conversations, way back when we first started last summer, and kind of kept up with a lot of those assumptions, but allowed our own biases to kind of direct our, this is probably what people want, because really that's what I want. And, quite often when you actually talk to customers and test out these products, it isn't what they want, because you've made a bunch of, personal assumptions around that. So yeah, I think it really just comes down to letting the customer lead the way, listening to them, empowering them. If we get into kind of marginalized communities, I think it's really important to bring those communities into your organization and promote them and, give them decision-making power. But, even without doing that, just listening.
Amazing, thank you. I just wanted to remind the audience that if you've got a question for either Billie or Eva, please pop it in the chat, and we will try and get around to as many of them as possible at the end of the session. So the credit scoring market is still one of the slowest to innovate and evolve and change. So it seems like the whole sector is a bit stuck in their ways. I mean, obviously, Borrowell was the first free credit scoring agency, and it's 7 years old. That's still so young. So how can we use data democratization to help bring the credit scoring industry up to speed, Eva?
Yeah, well, I think one of the things is just there's been lots of work done, I think, over the last few years in using different kinds of data outside of credit scores and outside of data that the credit bureaus would typically provide. I think that's a really exciting space, especially, again, for those who are living paycheck to paycheck and or those who, I think the technical term is thin file, like maybe new to the country or new to credit. For those people, or for people who are trying to rebuild, I think the existing model is a bit limited and may not be as indicative of someone's creditworthiness as, I think we all want to say, hey, like you are more than a number, and we think that's true. So we are working with some of our partners to say, we just acquired a company, Refresh Financial, that has a credit building loan. So someone makes regular loan payments and they unlock the equity that they've sort of paid down, so they don't get the cash right at the very beginning. But what they want to do is they want to be able to improve their credit score so that they can get a cash loan. This is just a way of proving to the credit bureaus they can make some on-time payments. But in addition to sort of improving their credit score, they're also proving to a potential lender that they can actually make 12 on-time payments. So we're working with a partner right now, a lender who is going to guarantee that if someone makes 12 months of on-time payments, they will then offer a cash loan of that same amount with that same payment frequency. Because again, they've demonstrated that over the last year, even if the credit score doesn't improve. And there's lots of things that go into a credit score. But I think using alternative data like this is going to be helpful. And I know there's lots of exciting companies that are also looking at ways to assess someone's creditworthiness that are outside of the sort of traditional credit scoring.
And obviously over the last year, when some people's finances might have taken a hit because of the COVID-19 pandemic, what sort of changes or trends have you seen over the past year, Eva?
Yeah, maybe surprisingly, at least in Canada, there were a number of government supports and programs, especially in the early days of the pandemic. And then which meant that for a lot of people, they actually had more regular, more dependable cash flow at the same time where people weren't spending as much. So we actually saw credit utilization on credit cards and revolving lines like that decrease. And we saw a subsequent increase in people's credit scores. So I think we are concerned as people's spending comes back up, whether that will hold. But for sure, maybe surprisingly, at least compared to what we had thought might happen with people's credit scores, some of those government programs, I think, were actually helpful combined with the decrease in spending.
And obviously, Billie, Daylight is a year old, so you started it right in the heat of the pandemic. So what sort of trends have you seen with your customers over the past year?
I think fundamentally just a deep dissatisfaction with the way that things are. To kind of Eva's point earlier around other ways that people are, building credit. I've seen some really exciting companies here in the US that are, furnishing reports with things like rent payments, because that is a monthly payment that you make on time every month, pretty much in perpetuity for most of us. I think, encouraging companies and indeed encouraging, big companies like the credit bureaus here. I was saying to everyone that I've been trying not to drink coffee, and it's clearly just messing with my ability to talk as well as I normally can. But encouraging the credit bureaus to start thinking about different ways, different data that they can take in to assess someone's creditworthiness too, because alternative credit assessment products are great, but fundamentally most big banks and big loan providers still use companies like Equifax and TransUnion. So I think that is something that's really important. And I think COVID has been an opportunity for everyone to kind of assess their entire lives and kind of take a moment to kind of be like, is this really working for us? Am I happy with what I'm doing? And I think that has kind of, been reflected in consumers, dissatisfaction and desire to find new products. And I think that neobanks will continue to just eat incumbents' share of the market, because we're just able to build a lot faster and to serve consumers more deeply.
I mean, the market in the US is obviously considerably larger than it is here in the UK, but over the past couple of years, and particularly within the last 15, 18 months, a lot of the digital banks have really started to etch away at the incumbents' control over consumers. And I think that's really telling of how willing people are to adopt to these new methods and join these new companies because they're doing something a bit different. And people, at the end of the day, I think, are bored of banking. And I think they're bored of the traditional banks and they're bored of the traditional methods. And so I think it's really telling that so many fintechs all over the world have really begun to solidify themselves in the financial services industry. And I mean, Daylight and Borrowell are definitely two of those to have done that. But would you say that the main barrier to true data democratization comes from the sort of consumer side or the business side? Eva, I'll come to you first.
It's a great question. I think in the early days, we used to say that the biggest barrier was actually on the consumer side. Again, especially I think 7 years ago, where you had to use fintech. In quotes, people didn't really know what fintech was as a term. And I think there really was a lack of awareness and inertia around, you might complain about your bank, but are you actually willing to go and do something different? And I definitely see that changing over time. And for sure, the pandemic has accelerated that change, as people they don't want to go into a bank branch. Or as I did, I thought that your anecdote about checks is very funny. I had to order a new checkbook. It's 2021. I was running out of checks. I really don't use them that often, but yeah, for doing some home renovations, it's in order to transfer more than $3,000 a day, you have to have a checkbook. It's the most efficient way of doing this. So yeah, there's definitely something wrong when, again, you're ordering a book of paper checks. We're supposed to have flying cars now, right? I should have had a checkbook. I would say now that I do think regulation needs to catch up, at least in Canada, the US, and many other countries around the world where there isn't an open banking framework that's been agreed. And I do think that the scales are tipped in the favor of the incumbent banks. And we should be putting the control into the hands of consumers who would say, this is my data. I want to share it with this company. And I think they can do a better job helping me achieve my financial goals, because maybe that's not what the bank has in mind. So I think it's getting to the point now where, yeah, it's still not an even playing field. One of the banks in Canada has over $10 billion in annual profit, not revenue, annual profit. Wow. How are fintech companies supposed to compete with that, especially when they've have 100-year advantage on data? So I do think that if I had to pick today, I'd probably go with regulation, even though maybe 5 years ago I would have said on the consumer side.
I mean, back to your point about checks, I'm not sure if that's more indicative of my age or the banking state of banks over here in the UK. But yes, no, I've never had a checkbook, and I don't think I ever will. But same question to you, Billie. Do you think one of the main barriers to true data democratization comes from the consumer or the business side?
I think there are challenges on both sides. I think that, while it's important to give consumers, as much information as possible, I think it's also important to educate those consumers and make sure they understand what it is that they're kind of getting, and that they are making kind of good decisions with whatever data is made available to them. But I would agree ultimately that, it has to come. We need better regulation and really just more up-to-date regulation in pretty much every country, because it's also archaic. It's all based on very old conceptions of what banking can look like, and I think that it would be a great way for regulators to kind of engender trust from consumers if they showed that they were on the side of the consumer for once, rather than kind of bowing to lobbying and large incumbents. And focusing on profit versus actually focusing on the best needs of the consumer.
I mean, here in the UK and across Europe, rather, we have the PSD2, which is the Payment Services Directive Mach 2, which is what brought open banking to the UK and Europe. And I think that that has really helped spur along a lot of the fintechs here and across Europe to adopt these new methods and to get consumers more aware of open banking and data democratization, and how at the end of the day it is there to help them. And it's not something that I think people are starting to become more aware that they have other options outside of the big banks, particularly here in the UK. So it'll be interesting to see where it goes. But that is a great segue into my next question. What trends do we think we'll see coming out of data democratization and open banking? Where do you see it going in a couple of months, years, that sort of thing? Eva, I'll come to you first.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's true about personal finance, I'll say on the consumer side, is that 10 years ago, 5 years ago, maybe even today, if you want really great personalized financial advice, you can get it if you have money to pay an advisor. And I think with data democratization, the idea is that we should be able to use technology and data to help everyone have access to the best personal financial advice. And that's really what our goal is. We want people to feel very confident that when they get their paycheck in, or maybe again, it's not a regular paycheck, that they sort of know where that money is going to go. They know, what's the best loan option for them if they need to get an auto loan. They know, what's the best credit card for them. They know how much money to put into an emergency savings account or to save for that vacation. And I think we can do that if we have access to people's data. And so I think the world will be a very different place, again, if we can democratize that and really make that, available to everyone, and not just for like the select few who can pay someone to, go through reams of your financial data and understand what your financial goals are. I think it's very possible. But yeah, we need the right regulatory framework, I think, to help accelerate that.
And Billie, what would you say?
Yeah, I would kind of build off that and just say, in general, like hyper personalization is like a huge trend at the moment. Obviously, kind of biased when building FinTech for a very specific community. What's interesting about building for a specific community is when you get there, you realize that actually even that community has very specific and nuanced needs across the entire group. And I think with data, with technology, with open banking, we're able to to build for all of these different nuances of the community and create really personalized products. You've kind of seen it, in like social media with like algorithmic data stuff. But I think it'd be really interesting to see how that translates to things like financial education, financial products, and that kind of thing. And I think it's ultimately, a great thing, because it means that there will be a huge amount of choice for the consumer ultimately. Even I know we have spoken mostly about the kind of consumer side with data democratization, but the other kind of interesting thing about like access to data in general is that it's allowed us as a company to build and scale super fast. We started jamming on this idea last summer, and we were in beta by December. And I think that's partially due to the fact that there are all these amazing fintechs now at the different levels of the banking as a service stack that allow us to kind of scale and build super fast. And I think what that ultimately does is democratizes access to building products. It would have cost, I remember speaking to the Simple founders about their journey of taking a product to market, and it was years and years, because they had to build most of these protocols and APIs with their banking partner from scratch. Now there is pretty much a plug and play, and then you can start to do all of like the fun and interesting personalization stuff on top. So I think that's also a really interesting thing.
And now Simple is no more as well. That's one of the first digital banks, and it's already left the market. But getting a little bit more specific to Daylight, what does the future look like for Daylight in the next 6, 12 months or so?
Yeah, so I kind of suggested a little earlier, but the main thing we're looking at, and it is a very data heavy thing, is around the idea of spending with purpose and kind of making sure that your own conception of who you are and your values and the things that you want to support match your spending behaviors. And we're kind of bootstrapping that at the moment with kind of existing data. But as we kind of get more nuanced, it's a really interesting thing to start to assess. Like had a really interesting conversation with one potential customer around ESG stocks and the idea that like Apple is an LGBT friendly business, right? There's currently a gay CEO, it'd probably be quite hard to argue. But someone gave the point of, well, actually they have factories in countries that have anti-LGBT laws.
Yeah.
And so it becomes this really interesting, like almost philosophical question of like, how deep do you go when you assess a company's values? And how deep do you have to go as a company with who you partner with? So that's kind of the main thing we're focusing on. We're still in beta, as I said, for a couple more months, aiming for later this year to come out of beta and be available to the public. And yeah, just lots of little bits and pieces, but those are the main things that we're focusing on.
It's interesting to hear that sort of there's a really big ESG focus in the US, because it's really, really big over here in the UK. I mean, green finance is kind of having a boom. Everyone's coming out with more eco-friendly pensions, more eco-friendly investment accounts. It's a really, really big trend over here. So it is sort of interesting to see that it can hop across the pond, if you will.
It's starting to, definitely.
Yeah. And Eva, the same question to you. What sort of is coming up for Borrowell?
Yeah, well, I mentioned briefly that we acquired another company earlier this year, which gave us 2 financial products. So I think we're excited to continue to grow and build and launch new products. I think one of the benefits of having a marketplace is you can see where there are gaps and where there are lots of people who are looking for products, but there may not be a product in the Canadian ecosystem that sort of meets that need. So we're excited to potentially launch our own new products, or potentially through an acquisition, acquire those. So I think we've had a very positive experience with combining 2 companies. We doubled our size earlier this year, and I think we've sort of seen that as an interesting avenue for growth as well.
And any plans to expand outside of Canada?
At this point, no. We come back to that every 6 months or so, but I think there's still lots to do in Canada. We have close to 2 million members, so we're, I think, at a good scale, and we still think there's like lots of room to grow. So far staying in Canada, but who knows?
And obviously expansion plans are probably a little bit too far down the line, but do you think you'd ever come back to your native UK, Billie?
Yeah, I mean, one of my co-founders is British, and my other co-founder lived in London for about 15 years. So we have a lot of connection to London. And I think when we think about daylight, 10 years in the future, there are LGBT people everywhere in every country, and we have specific financial needs that are actually quite nuanced in different countries, depending on, local laws and different dynamics and that kind of thing. So I think definitely looking to expand eventually once we've kind of gotten the US down pat a little more. And I think the challenge with expanding, we won't be able to provide the exact same kind of product or product stack in each country. So it will kind of be a different challenge for each country.
And we sort of mentioned this term a little bit earlier, but just quickly, because I can see that we're rapidly running out of time. Open finance, it's something that's floated around a lot over here in the UK. And it's essentially the idea that open banking will creep into every aspect of the financial world. Do you think that that's something that will ever reach, or is it still a bit of a pipe dream? Eva, I'll come to you first.
I certainly hope it does. Let's start with open banking, but I certainly hope open finance reaches our shores as well.
Amazing. And Billie, same question to you.
Yeah, I don't see why not. I think it'd be great. I think ultimately transparency just gives you, gives you as a consumer more control and more power, and that is ultimately a good thing.
I mean, I think most people would be able to tell that we're all kind of very for open banking and open finance and data democratization and everything that comes along with it. So, but yeah, I think unfortunately that's all that we have time for today. So thank you so much for joining me both. I hope you enjoyed this discussion as much as I did. And if you want to catch up on any of the sessions, they will all be on demand. So don't worry if you missed any. But yeah, I'd like to hand back to Olga for now. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much for this insightful discussion, which basically leaves me with one of my key takeaways: make no assumptions about your customers and actually try to make the data speak. That brings me also to the wrap up of today. I hope you did enjoy the full FinTech finance stage. I hope you took something away for yourself, some insights, some good thoughts. What has stuck with me personally was starting the day from discussing around the broader concept of sustainability and what is it that we need to do in order to accelerate that it needs both tech, coordination, investment, but also starts with each and every one of us. And one quote that really stuck with me from session 2 from Mark was, climate, we won't get a second chance. And then in the afternoon, we took it all over discussing, the big drive for innovation in insurtech, stock markets being available to everybody, and some notion that this would even accelerate open banking standards, data. I think it's been a super insightful day. And again, this wouldn't have been possible without the support of all of the CogX partners. So one more time, a big and full-hearted thank you to Accenture, BT, Quantum League, Visa, and the supporting partners Shell and Big Innovation Center. Tomorrow, FinTech and Finance Stage continues, starting at 10 o'clock BST, and I hope you will have a wonderful and insightful day with lots of discussions. And as it already has been mentioned many times, if you have missed a session, you can all watch it wonderfully on YouTube after this festival, and are, of course, encouraged to tweet about this, speak about this, share your knowledge, share your insights, so that we all together get the next 10 years right. That's so much from me. Thank you very much, and have a wonderful evening.